Hey everyone, my name is Paul Hallett. I'm a lead software engineer currently, and I've been working with HTTP APIs and Python for nearly my entire career. And today I want to tell you about a project that I've been working on for over 2 years. It's called Clientele. And the aim of Clientele is to really bring together all of my experiences with integrating and using client libraries with HTTP APIs, specifically for the Python ecosystem. And the reason I'm sharing and building this project is because I've had a lot of bugbears and issues with it throughout my career, and I've seen a lot of things attempted but not quite done as good as it could be. And Clientele is sort of like an experiment slash solution to those issues that I'm seeing. So before I give you the lowdown on what Clientele is, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of myself and HTTP APIs and OpenAPI and Swagger to give you some framing. So as I said, my name's Paul. I've worked with APIs for a good decade now, and in Python. And one of the very first things I ever built was a website, an API called PokeAPI. And the PokeAPI was born from a presentation I had at university about HTTP and hypertext. And it was a very philosophical presentation. It was more about the potential of hypermedia and the potential of web APIs. And the lecturer lamented that they weren't able to find any decent examples of APIs that matched sort of the intention of REST and sort of took advantage of the transport medium. And so I thought, well, if no one out there is doing it, let me try, because it feels really obvious to me. And so I made the Pokemon API using a data set for Pokemon. So I've been into Pokemon basically my entire life, ever since it started, really. Well, I was about 7 or 8 when it started, so not my entire life, but you know what I'm talking about. And no one had ever made an API for this. There was CSVs and databases available on GitHub, but there wasn't really any web APIs, so I made one. And it ended up being quite popular. It legitimately does get billions of API calls every month because it's open and it's free, and a lot of people use it now for teaching. So that helped me learn a lot about good API design and sort of launched my career and my hyper focus in that particular area that I really enjoy. It was around the time that I finished PokeAPI that something came along called Swagger, which was later renamed to OpenAPI. OpenAPI is a specification for formalizing HTTP APIs. So it describes what goes into the API, what comes out of the API, what operations or actions are available, like reading data or creating data. And at the same time as this, the SaaS software as a service boom happened. So in Silicon Valley, you had companies like Twilio, which I worked for, Stripe, SendGrid, and loads of other companies really pushing HTTP APIs as products. So they were actually, the whole point of them was like, this is something that you give to a developer and that they can integrate with. So once I'd finished PokeAPI, there was this boom in standardization. And the OpenAPI standard, which has a bad name because obviously OpenAPI, it's hard to easy to conflate them, but they are very distinct. Now OpenAPI has become very standardized, and tools like FastAPI will auto-generate you OpenAPI schemas. There's a Django REST framework one called DRF Spectacular, and all of these tools will produce OpenAPIs schemas for you to go and use. And a lot of the time you might see documentation, and that's actually generated from these schemas. So it's very well standardized, but I've always found personally there to be I call it the last mile problem. If you've ever had a chat with me about this, I call it the last mile problem because the developer experience for creating these schemas is really good. But that last mile of doing the client-side integration has still never felt quite right. There's still a lot of issues with it. And this is what Clientele is trying to focus and solve. And so I want Clientele to be a bit like the FastAPI of OpenAPI client generators in that it has a really good developer experience. And let me tell you a little bit about the other client generators out there, which are, there's loads of them. There's many options, and some of them do things very well. But there aren't any that I would personally use for a few reasons. Often the tooling you need to use those generators is not the tooling you're used to in the Python world. Some of them require you to set up Docker containers just to generate some code or install Java and things like this. The code that it makes or outputs is oftentimes quite obtuse. There's loads of it basically, and it's quite complicated. It's oftentimes clear that the generators are not producing code with the mindset of Python, like idiomatic Python that Python engineers are used to, or it's not using tooling that Python developers care about. You know, OpenAPI schemas are really good at producing very clear inputs and outputs, and the Python world has developed a lot in the last decade, and we care a lot now about strong typing, very well formatted code. And a lot of these tools don't always take advantage of that. So a lot of the times I just don't bother using these client generators. And my experience has been mirrored by a lot of people I've worked with and a lot of people I've talked with. Oftentimes their requirements are very specific and they just want to write a plain HTTP client abstraction over them. They don't really want to use the schema. And the schema really, its most useful aspect is generating documentation. It's taking that machine readable schema and creating documentation. So I thought, well, we have a great experience for creating schemas. Why can't we have a great experience for creating the clients from those schemas? And that was one aspect of the Clientele story. The other one was 2 years ago, I was doing, again, an HTTP API integration between two services in a company. So we own both. We're building one alongside the other. And I thought, okay, cool. Now's a good time. Let's have a look again. What is available in the OpenAPI world? Because I've not done it for about a year. That could solve this problem. And again, I couldn't find one that quite fitted. Either it couldn't handle the schema because it just would, the schemas, despite being well defined, a lot of the schemas that generators out there aren't always generating the right outputs. But generally it was because the developer experience and what code was being produced wasn't great. And I just didn't give me a lot of confidence. And there were a few client generators that would generate the schema at runtime. So what you couldn't see what was available until you sort of introspected that schema in a shell or as the application was running. So, you don't have autocomplete in your IDE. The typing is just, you don't know it's going to work, which was not great. So what I did is I have like a little scratch pad with like, here's my basic API client that I like to use. I just copied and pasted that again. And 1 second, it wants me to leave the call. I'm going to stay in the call. There we go. Let me get the other window back. What I ended up doing is copying and pasting this template over. And then once I'd set up all the integration by reading the schema with my eyes, writing the operations, writing the schema objects, I thought, hang on a minute, like this is arguably what I want from a client generator. So why can't I take this and work backwards, thinking developer first, and make a code generator that produces this output, this being what I enjoy using, what I think most Python developers enjoy using. Why can't that be almost like my criteria? Like, can I make a code generator produce that? And can I make it work in the way of like Django's start project command, where I can just use it to give me the boilerplate, and then I can take it away. Or if I want to maintain using Clientele, I can use that to keep my API up to date. But if I want to, I just want to, at the bare minimum, generate me a sensible starting point. And that was the start of Clientele. And so Clientele now, after 2 years and a lot of work and trial and effort, testing, using, finding issues, tweaking, recognizing opportunities that I could make it better, I've got it to a 1.0 release. And so I'm going to tell you now, and I'm going to demonstrate Clientele to you now using an example project that I have. And so to remind you what Clientele is, what Clientele does is it creates HTTP client libraries in Python code. It's not a dependency. It generates the code for you to do the integration by reading the schema. And it gives you Pydantic models. So it uses Pydantic for all of its inputs and outputs. It's fully typed. It's auto-formatted with rough as well. So the output doesn't need to be formatted. It's already done for you. It can support async and sync because it's using HTTPX under the hood. It can also generate class-based or functional-based, up to you. The output's really small. It's only 5 files. 2 of them are the only ones you really need to care about. And it's designed in a way that's got a really good developer experience with updating APIs. So if the schema updates, because Clientele's deterministic, you can run it again. You can look at the git diff and you can see what's changed. You can obviously then review it confidently and say, I understand what's changed, and then you can ship it. When I was using Clientele a lot for my personal projects, I would often generate a client, load a shell, import it, and play with it. And I realized, hang on a minute, I could just build a REPL that does exactly this, specifically for that client library. And why do I even need to generate the client library myself beforehand? Why can't I just have the explore function do that for me? So it has a REPL that you can take immediately right now, any OpenAPI on the web, and provide that, and it will allow you to load in and start making API calls. And it's deterministic. So you could get your favorite coding agent to produce this for you almost identically, but the benefit of Clientele is it's a tiny Python package. It doesn't cost any expensive compute, and it always produces the same output. And there's 2 people who should be using it if you're trying to connect to an HTTP API with a Python project and you want a really confident and reliable framework. And if you're publishing an OpenAPI schema and you want to provide a Python library, Clientele will do that for you. I could talk more and more about the internals, but it's better if I just show you. So on the left-hand side here, I have a FastAPI project running. Now this is the project that's running in the GitHub repository, and I have an example for FastAPI, Django REST framework, and Django Ninja, and they all run and they all have a client. You can go and play with them all, and you can see how it works. And I've targeted those specifically because, well, I'll get into the compatibility later on. So you can use UVX right now, which is a tool that comes with UV for just finding packages on the internet and running immediately, because it's a command line tool. So I'm using the latest version here, which is 1.1, and I'm gonna very quickly generate the client library. So I won't go into the command here, but basically you can do much, but you can provide either a URL or a file, and it will generate that way, and then an output directory. And that should now generate me a client library. So it's called the OpenAPI schema there, and then it's provided me with the output, and it said it's created 4 schemas, 2 get methods, a post method, a sync version, because I've not told it to create an async version. The only thing that Clientele relies on for production is HTTPX and Pydantic. If you already use these, you can use Clientele. For testing, it's got a really nice integration with RESPX, and testing is really easy. And testing allows you to do a full breadth test right down to the transport layer. So you can test the models are inputting and outputting correctly, which is really nice. And you can copy and paste these straight into your Py project. Let's look at this code. So over here, this is the code that you get from a clientele generation. The schema, in fact, I'll make this much, much larger so you folks can see it nicely. The schema will generate Pydantic models with your inputs and outputs. Anyone who uses FastAPI knows about validation error. This is when FastAPI fails to validate the data. This is a response. And you can even handle things like list responses and edge cases in OpenAPI 3.1 are handled nicely. So these are all nicely handled here. The other file that you'll care a lot about is the client, and this provides you with, in this case, functions with your strongly typed inputs. If it's class-based, you get a class that wraps around this that takes a config object. Host methods or patch or methods where you send data, they take a data argument which has a strong typing. And you can see here we handle a lot of modern typing responses as well. There's a way for you to configure clientele that never gets changed when you regenerate, and that's using the config object, which is based on Pydantic settings. So you can handle environment variables and .env files nicely. And your configuration is all done here, and you can change this and you can modify it in whatever way you want. You can make these into Python properties. You can, so long as you're creating this config at the end and it's got the correct dot notation, it will work. So this is your entry point for your own configuration. And as you can see, we handle things like authentication for bearer auth and token authentication, as well as a load of extra additional config that you might want to do thanks to HTTPX. Now, one thing this doesn't do is correctly set the port, but that's just because of how the OpenAPI schema works. So I'm going to just modify that there. Another thing that might be interesting for you to look through is the manifest. This is a markdown file that just explains how this client was generated. It gives you a command that you can rerun in the future if you want to regenerate it. It tells you the versions that it was installed with, and it tells you how to explore with that client library, which is what we're going to do now. So coming back here, I'm just going to clear this window, and I'm going to run UVX explore. And this is going to run the client library in the explore mode. Now, like I said, I don't have to provide a generated code. I can just provide a schema and it will auto-generate for me. When you're in the explore mode, you can do things like look at all your operations. You can look at all your schemas. You can inspect those schemas to see what sort of values they take. You can set your debug mode to pretty print a lot of information about the HTTP layer. And you can also look at the config and you can change the config. So if you want to quickly tweak or test out your authentication or the URLs, you can quickly swap that out. Let's go ahead and actually call the API now. So we're just going to get the users from my service here, and you get this debug operation telling you the method, the URL, and the response types. And then it validates because it's actually calling the real Python functions through this REPL, and you get back your pretty printed response. I'll show you an example using parameters. So this would be like /users/ an ID, and there it shows you your input arguments. And then I'll just quickly do an example using a post method. And what it needs to do for this is it needs to validate the input parameters with the correct model. So create user there will create me a user. It's done a post request. And then when I list the users again, it shows me all the users. That REPL is fantastic for very quickly testing against an API. You can run it against my Pokemon API, for example, and then you can start testing that API without having to run your own shell. It's all done for you. It also has history, so you can go back through the history and look at previous commands, which I think is very nice. So let's talk about OpenAPI compatibility. I've explained to you how it can work and how you can use it, but how compatible is it? I've very specifically targeted FastAPI, Django REST framework with DRF Spectacular and Django Ninja, because those are the most common web API web APIs in Python that produce OpenAPI schemas. But I also found when I was building this a directory by OpenAPI's Guru, and this directory has well over 4,000 API schemas. And so for each of these schemas, Clientele runs a cron job every week. It pulls down every single one and it tries to generate clients. And about 2,000 of those are the modern version of OpenAPI 3.0 or 3.1. And we can successfully generate clients for 95% of those. That last 4%, in my experience, tinkering and looking, is generally malformed schemas, not poor implementation on Clientele's part. But if you run your own schema against this and you find an issue and it is a bug with Clientele, then please let me know, because you can help improve Clientele. And we tested that against well over 2,000 of those. Not by hand, obviously, like I said, a cron job take me forever. There's working examples for FastAPI, Django REST framework, and Django Ninja in the project. And additional features for Clientele is the authentication. So it handles bearer and token authentication. It also handles additional headers. So if you have your own custom, that's sort of handled. For the testing, testing is very easy to do because you can use RESPEX to mock out your tests. Here's a example, but the project has tons of those. And finally, the one thing I would say with exception handling is you can handle responses nicely if you're getting an unexpected response back. Unexpected being defined by the API schema. So where do I want to take Clientele? Well, it's definitely 1.0 and usable and nice. I would love to build this and develop it more and try and push this idea of that, like, clients need to have a good developer experience. They need to be lovable. Whether or not that's this project that does that or it helps to encourage other people, I don't know. But please try it out. Like I said, if you have UVX or PipX, you can run this today without having to even install it. It will just run. It's a very tiny little project, and it should unlock a lot of productivity and a lovable experience for client integration. Thank you.